Hello and welcome. So in this video we're going to talk about input and allowing the user to type in some information and use that in our program, whether it's going to be a string, integer or a float. So I'm going to open up idle, go to new file as always, and when first starting out, some people like to use a simple print statement to show the question and then input afterwards. So I'm going to show that as the first example. So print, what is your name? And then I'm going to say name equals input as a function, and then we're just going to print for the moment your name is name. So this will print out the question, what is your name? It will then, using the input function, give the user a chance to type in their name, and then anything the user types in on the keyboard will be stored in the variable name. And then when we print it, it should say your name is, and then it will print whatever they have typed in. So let's give this a go, and I will need to save it, of course. So save, YouTube, input, and it will say what is your name. So I can type Mr. Fryer with spaces, everything else included, and it won't do anything until I press enter. So when I press enter on the screen, that will be sent off to the variable name, and now it will say your name is Mr. Fryer, and I didn't actually need that space, so if I get rid of that one space, it will say that without having too many gaps between the colon and Mr. Fryer. So all that's happened, I printed out a question, asked the user for some input, that what has been typed in has gone into the variable name, and then it says your name is, and it's printed out whatever I typed in. Now, rather than using a print statement up here, we can make this simpler. We can copy and paste this, delete this line, and put the question inside the brackets for the input function, and this will do the same as before but using only two lines. So variable equals input and then the question inside the brackets, and it will do exactly the same. And this is a better way, it's more efficient, uses less lines of code. I think it's neater, it's easier to read, but some people when they're first starting out prefer, because they're used to print statements, to do it the other way, and there's not really anything particularly wrong with that. The next stage is to create some kind of integer. So if we want someone's age, instead of just writing input, I'm going to write int input, how old are you, and then I'm going to print you are age years old. And what this will do is it will ask the question how old are you, it will allow the user to type something in, and then it will convert whatever the user has typed in into an integer, which is what int is short for, and then store that in the variable age. And this will simply say you are whatever the user typed in years old. So when I run this, I'll go Mr. Fryer, we'll go 25, it will say you are 25 years old. Now there is one problem with this, in that if the user is not perhaps sensible or makes a mistake and they type something that isn't a whole number, then we might get a different result. So if I do Mr. Fryer and say 20 using text instead of numbers, we will get an error. and it says invalid literal for int with base 10, 20. And effectively it's saying the word 20 is not a base 10 number, it is not an ordinary number, and we can't convert it into an integer. We can also see if I type Mr. Fryer, and for the age we put 25.4 for some reason, then again it will say invalid literal for int with base 10, 25.4. All it's saying is you can't convert that number into an integer that has a decimal place. It is not a whole number. So if the user does make a mistake, then it will cause problems. You can actually do this with a space, so I can say Mr. Fryer, and I can say 25 with a space afterwards, and it will ignore the space and still allow it as just the number 25 and convert it. And to prove that this has been changed into an integer, I can print type age, and when I run this, it will say it is of type int. So age is in fact an int, not a string. When you do an ordinary input, it will automatically create a string. I can show that here. So print type name, and if I do this, Mr. Fryer 25, it will say int, that is for age, and str string is for name. So name using normal input is just a string. We can do the same for a float. So if I do height equals float input, how tall are you? And print you are height tall. We can see that this will do a very similar thing. Let's add 8 centimeters there. So how old am I? 25, 183.5, and it will now say you are 183.5 centimeters tall. You will notice it still has a space that is a side effect of the comma. I will leave that in there for now. So this has allowed the user to type in a float. We have the same problem as before. If they type anything other than a float, we're going to have some problems. So if I put 20 again, it will say could not convert string to float 20. Effectively, you can't convert the word 20 into a float. It will allow you to use normal numbers though, so if you just put 183, it will automatically add 0.0 on the end and will accept it as 183.0. And we can prove again that this is the correct data type. Height. And I'll type this again. And it will now say class float to say that the height variable is now a float. So there are a couple of important considerations with this, in that if we ask the user for two numbers and add them together, if they are two strings, as we discussed previously, it will put them next to each other. So if I do number1 equals input enter a number, and number2 equals input enter a second number, and do answer equals number1 plus number2, and then print answer. If we run this and we type two numbers 5 and 4, it will, as they are both strings, automatically when you use input, always if you haven't added anything to the left, it will automatically be a string. So 5 plus 4 is strings, simply puts them next to each other and gives 54. If we want to use proper numbers and addition, we have to add int to both numbers, number 1 and number 2. And now if I run this, 5 and 4 is equals to 9. So 5 plus 4 is 9. And if we want to allow them to type floats, we would have to add float in order to do something like 5.5, and 3.5 is 9.0. So if you want to do any maths, if you want maths based on whole numbers, you need them to enter integers. If you want maths based on floating point numbers or any decimal numbers, or really ideally if you're doing division or multiplication, you should ideally use float for the inputs rather than integer. If you try to do normal string input, so we have just input for both of them, and we try to multiply these together, and in Python and most other programming languages you use this star symbol, which is shift and the 8 key on your keyboards, then that will give you the star, and that is for multiplication. If we try to multiply two strings together from input, it will give us an error. So if I do this and run it and type 5 and 4, it will say you can't multiply sequence by non-int of type str. Effectively it's saying you can't times two strings together. That doesn't make sense. However, you can if you change it to int. So you can do int input for both, and now 4 times 5 is 20. And while you can use divide, and divide is the backslash, so number 1 divide number 2 within two integers, we could do 6 and 3, it will automatically create a float. And I would say it's actually better to have both of these as float if you do that. And although you won't get a different answer, 6 and 3 is still 2.0, it's just better practice to automatically ask for floats, and then you're going to know as you go through that the answer is going to be a float. Whereas sometimes if you do int divide int, you might still think it's an integer later on and try to do something based on that, whereas in fact it is now actually a float. And of course with this, if the user still types in something that is wrong, like 20, it will still come out with the old error message. There is a way to get around this, or force the user to actually enter data of the correct data type using while loops and try except blocks, which will be discussed in a video later on. For now, the last thing to consider for input is if we want the user to type some sort of Boolean value. So let's say we wanted heads, and we wanted to allow the user to enter some input so that the answer came out as true, rather than saying bool input, which does exist. It's better to do it a different way, and I will show you why. So if I say enter true if heads, false if tails, if I run this and we print heads, then if I type true, it will say true, but if I type false, it will also say true. So the way the bool function works with the input is if there is any value entered by the user at all from the input, then it will equate to true. The only way to get this to be false is to run it and just press enter without any input at all, no spaces, nothing, and it will equate to false. And while you could say enter a value if true, just press enter if it's false, I would say it's better to actually ask them for a string. So we could still say enter true if heads, false if tails, and then we can use an if statement or a list to check have they entered true or have they entered false, and then later on we could set heads to be true or false based on the result of that if statement, and that just eliminates any possible miscalculations or mistakes from the user, while also making sure that you have your correct Boolean value. We don't typically create Booleans from user input. Strings, integers and floats are used quite frequently for user input. Boolean not quite so much. So hopefully this has acted as a short tutorial based on input, and we've covered the core concepts, and we will talk about the ways to fix some issues such as the errors in another later video. Thank you for listening.